Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. I am Kara Baskin from the Boston Globe, and I am delighted to be moderating this panel today on such an important topic, which is, of course, talking to kids about the news. Um, I am very, very pleased to have the partnership of Apple TV. And on that note, I just want to give some quick little piece of housekeeping that I think would be really important, hopefully for some parents. For any of you parents with teens who are interested in pursuing a career in news, or if there are any teens watching who really love to write, the Boston Globe just launched a Young Reporters competition inspired by Home Before Dark on Apple TV. Anyone ages 14 to 18 can submit a local news story they wrote for a chance to win full admission to Boston University's Pre-College Summer Journalism Academy for this summer. Submissions are due by May 31st, and you can learn more and enter at globe.com/home before dark. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have a really wonderful lineup today. And when I call your name, each panelist can unmute and put yourself onto video. So Dr. Harold Koplowitz, who is the president of the Child Mind Institute in New York City, child psychiatrist and author of the newly released book, The Scaffold Effect. Dr. Tony Rayo, who has been a wonderful resource throughout my parenting columns here at the Globe. He's a family psychologist locally and author of The Power of Agency. Dr. Nina McConico, who's the executive director of the Child Witness to Violence Project at the Boston Medical Center. And last but certainly not least, Andy Rosen, my colleague at the Boston Globe, whose news podcast for kids, Extra Scoops, is on a bit of a hiatus while he is solving his own parenting problems in real life, and it will hopefully be returning soon. So thank you all so much for joining me. Andy, you can unmute and take yourself off of invisible mode as well. Hopefully. He'll get there eventually. One thing that I wanted to just start with, is Andy here? There he is. Hi, Andy. One thing I wanted to start with, just to situate all of us, is really for parents to know and to understand how much of the news are our children actually absorbing. And I think that, obviously what a preschooler might overhear is very different, obviously, than what a high schooler might know and understand. And so Dr. Koplowitz, I want to start with you. Could you just maybe walk us through the different levels of understanding based on ages? What are kids grasping at what age?
So I think it's really important that we talk to our kids about the news because if we don't, they will get the information from other kids. So kids 5 and under very often get news from their friends or from school, and sometimes they act as though they understand it, but they need some more translation. I think very often about after 9/11, the images of the planes going into the World Trade Center, very often, if you spoke to young kids, they thought the plane was repeatedly going into the building, and so it was a good time for parents to turn TV off and to protect their kids from those images. And kids who are, let's say, school-age kids from 6 to 12, preteens, they have great brains. They learn a lot. They can know what who, what, where, and when really means. But again, it's first facts, and then there's emotion involved with it. So it really takes time for, excuse me, for us to explain and make sure that we're asking questions. And we also have to be pretty sure that it's not just one little lecture, that it's a dialogue, that it's a conversation. And if they don't have any questions, well, then you can move on. I tell the story of a colleague of mine who called me during the Monica Lewinsky scandal at the White House, and friends of ours who were lawyers said, I don't know what to do. My second grader said that tonight she wants to figure out what's going on in the White House with the intern. And so I said, please make sure you listen carefully to the questions, only answer the questions, don't give more information than is necessary. And please remember, that a second grader is going to be 7 years old and what the vocabulary you use. And the follow up, of course, was that the girl got home and said at dinner, I don't understand. Why are there interns in the White House? Don't interns belong in a hospital? And the parents had prepared everything about oral sex and about intimacy. And clearly that was the confusion, So that really becomes very important. And then remember that with teenagers are hot. Do you mean they are boiling, they're freezing, they have a lot of feelings. And so, injustice, like when you hear about Black Lives Matter, when you contain a kid and say you just lost senior prom, junior prom, you're not going to be able to play football this year, you're not going to be in the play, you're going to have kids who have a lot of emotions about that. And so parents should recognize that just because someone feels and expresses very intense feelings about something, they don't need to react to it. They just need to listen and be able to provide a sounding board for them to be able to share and for you to share what you think your opinion is. So it's a very different role a parent plays for a 5-year-old, a 12-year-old, or a 17-year-old.
And I want to say, just as moderator, some of the topics in our chat might not be appropriate for younger kids. So I don't know who's home and who's not. But and then at the very end, we'll get to the Q&A where it might be a little bit more open-ended in terms of age group. But Nina, I want to talk to you because you made a really great point in our prep call on Friday when you were saying that even preschoolers are aware of what is going on. And I mean, I have a 4-year-old and I talk to my husband like two adults, and sometimes he's in the room and you take for granted, what they're absorbing and perhaps what they're not. So what would you say about that age group when parents together, and we have a lot to talk about right now as adults, we have a lot going on to manage in our worlds. And sometimes you can't help but talk when your children are overhearing you, even if you're not talking directly to them. So what are children witnessing and what are they taking in, even at that young an age, would you say?
Yeah, I think for kids that age, they really are taking the cues from their parents. And so they are very astute and attuned to when their parents might be feeling some kind of heightened anxiety, when their parents might be feeling particularly activated or charged about information that they've just heard on the news or something that is particularly distressing to them. And so I think it's really important for adults to be mindful of that for their children, and that children of that age are also then going to in turn kind of start to feel a little more agitated or charged or anxious. And they're going to be looking to
That
the
they can
adults
really
around
pick
them.
up on that, even if it's not verbal, even if it's just kind of the emotional temperature in the home.
Absolutely, absolutely, that they are very much attuned to not only the verbalizations that are coming out of the adults' mouths, but very tuned into body language and behavior. I mean, that is kind of how they understand the world and make decisions around safety and trust. And so I always say to parents, if you obviously, right, we want to be having conversations
Great.
at dinner table, but to maybe speak in more general terms, and be careful about sharing too many details, because I think as Harold was pointing out, like sometimes kids, they don't necessarily have the verbal sophistication to be able to understand more of the subtle nuances about what is happening, and may in fact think that if you are talking about an incident that it is happening right over and over and over again. So I think being really mindful and speaking in general terms, as when it comes to having these kinds of conversations around children, and then knowing that they are curious, and just because they're not necessarily saying anything or asking you a question, they still are internalizing and they still are hearing. And so that is something that you should also be aware of. And then I think the last thing that I will say about that is kind of being open and available and ready for
Mhm.
when your child of that age does come to you with a question about something that you may have been talking about, in the living room when you thought that they were asleep, or, at the dinner table. And I think we'll get into that a little bit
Yeah.
later and kind of some
Yeah.
specific strategies on how to do that.
Tony, one question for you, as somebody who deals a lot with teenagers, looking back, and I might be dating myself, but I remember in elementary school, the biggest news was the Challenger. Challenger blew up live on TV when I was in second grade, and they would wheel the TV on like on a stand and then wheel it out. And I remember the teacher just like wheeling out the TV when it happened, and that was it. And then the next big thing when I was in college was 9/11. And that was it, really, that I can remember for like a major, scary, traumatic news for kids. And I feel like nowadays, teenagers, like every day, there's something else, and they're taking in information through different channels. So, can you talk about, where are our kids actually hearing information, would you say? Is it social media? Is it like TikTok? Is it Instagram? Where are they getting their information, and who are they getting it from? So,
Well, it's
parents.
first of all, thanks for having me. It's
Yeah.
all of the above, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to date myself even further and tell you that
Please.
scary, awful things have always happened. So I can remember being very young and learning about the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Senator Robert Kennedy, Vietnam War, Watergate, on and on. So the difference is that the amount of information and the amount of mechanisms and channels and devices that bring it to our brains so fast, that's what's really overstimulating kids. So they're getting it, yes, once they're older, they're getting it from social media, but don't forget the human social channels, right? And those are, siblings, those are your parents, those are your teammates, classmates, cousins, that actually the information we get, particularly if it's more emotional, that's the one that's going to have the greatest impact. Tends to come from all these like ways in which like kids who are gaming, for example, are sharing bits and pieces of information. I would like to say one thing, which is, I've seen over the years the word news has become a negative. People are afraid of it, don't like it. A lot of really pejorative things around it. And I would just say that, if we thought of this as information, and if we took our time and we were clear about what kids were getting and how they were getting it, the information is not, even if it's about things that are scary and disastrous, don't have to have that negative, awful impact as the high-speed media that's really coming at kids' brains so quickly.
Mhm. As parents, how, and I throw this open to the panel and anybody can chime in, but how worried should we be when kids hear about something like a school shooting, or, obviously this has been a long standing worry about the pandemic. How much damage is being done when they hear about something so frightening and so perhaps above their level of sophistication? As parents, should we be explaining? Should we be protecting? What is our role as sort of gatekeepers of this information? And what is sort of the long-term impact, would you say, of living in this 24-hour news cycle? And I throw this open to any single one of you.
I don't think that's going to change. I think this 24 news cycle and the fact that our kids have access to so much different media than that television, that you talked about,
Yeah.
bringing in the TV, taking
They
the TV
wheeled
out,
it in? Yeah.
right? So I don't think that's going to change. I think we as parents have to become more sophisticated and recognize that certainly all kids turn out to be very egocentric, meaning, is it going to happen to me? So when they hear about somebody else's parents getting divorced, they feel a little bit of empathy, but then mom and dad, are you going to get divorced? If someone else is losing their house. And I would certainly believe that these shootings, that it seems that every day some young Black or young or older Black man is being shot, clearly has to have a very chilling effect on the anxiety levels of young Black children and teenagers. But simultaneously, it must have an effect even on all kids, because if it could happen to them and his hands were up, his hands were down, he did have a gun, he didn't have a gun, she had a knife, she didn't, these things are incredibly chaotic. And the fact that we have film of it is I think it's terrific because it'll hold people accountable, but it's also terrible because I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War, and what brought the Vietnam War to an end, as far as I was concerned, is they were showing dead bodies on Walter Cronkite. The nightly news was showing us how terrible Vietnam was, that what was going on in that jungle, and that had an effect on us. And I think that we have to remember that this kind of imagery can be very traumatic to kids, and that the first things we have to do is get them to understand what they saw, and secondly, to reassure them that it's not going to happen to them, or if, or why it's not going to happen to them. What are the safety valves? What are the guardrails that we have up to protect them?
Well, that's a good point. And Andy, as a parent and as somebody who does a podcast about this, how much do we err on the side of reassurance, and how much are we being naive and saying it can't happen to you? Like when you think about, talking about school shootings, right? And you're a parent, I'm a parent. I'd like to send my son off to school and say, that won't happen here. It's very rare. It's very unusual. It's a freak occurrence. That might be true, but can I assure my child of absolute safety? No, I'd be lying if I said it would never happen. So how do you navigate that? And you're a journalist as well. So, you're trained to ask questions. You're trained to be skeptical. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, asking questions is probably a great way to start. All the stuff that we're talking about, every kid is different, and every set of facts that every kid holds in their mind is different. And so you may not know what your kid knows, wants to know, thinks that is not true, knew going in. The curiosity they have about it may be completely in another direction. Obviously we have great experts here talking about what the tendencies of children at various ages are, but any individual kid may take a completely different tack. So I would just say, ask your kid what they know. If they're worried about something, have them describe to you what they know about it, and ask them what they're interested in and what they want to know. To me, obviously a school shooting is a really hard one because it's so close to home, and we have to be good at all of these things, but there are a lot of news stories that you can approach with them the same way you might approach. Okay, so the other day my kid asked me what lightning was. I remember I knew what this was at some point. Now, that's not news. What is lightning? But I just said, Dale, I do not know exactly how lightning comes out of clouds. I think it actually might go up from the ground. I need to look this up, and we're gonna find out about lightning. But right now I just don't have the information. So what would you want to know about it? So we just talked about it, and what did he think about it? We had a good conversation. He was happy, and I didn't have any answers, and it's okay not to have answers, right? You don't necessarily know. You're not going to solve these societal problems for these kids and just say, no, it's okay now, so I think really just reading the room is really important with kids. And again, I have little kids. I've mostly worked with content for little kids, so that may be my limitation here, but that's how I approach it.
Real question is, do you know about lightning now?
Right. What do you learn from this, Andy?
We moved on to
I'm so glad, Andy, I'm so glad you admitted you don't know about it, because
no, I don't know about
I actually went to
lightning.
medical school, and I'm trying to think, how would I answer that in a way that a kid could understand?
I didn't know about lightning then, and honestly, we moved on to another subject, and I pledge to all of you here today that I will look up lightning when this call ends.
Well, that's the thing.
If anyone wants to jump in and explain how it works, that's fine too. But I mean, it's just anything you want to explain, you may not know,
Right.
So.
Right. And I think
say that sorry, Kara, just if I could just interject, is just to say that scaffolding piece, I think, is what is really most important, because right, our kids, I'm a parent too, and they're going to be exposed to things that maybe some of it we knew they were, other things we don't. And I think what matters is how we have the conversations with them and how we help them to understand it in the context of other things that are around them. And then that piece around, that not everyone has ill intent, right? That there are in fact individuals and adults in this world who are helpful and who are caring, and that there's a lot of people kind of working on making sure that we can all stay safe. But I think that scaffolding piece is really, really important to help kids. And then the other thing I think is, if we could be a little more solution focused too, and thinking of what can we do as a family, or what can you do as child, older, middle schooler, adolescent, to kind of work and kind of to help kind of mitigate or kind of work against some of these things that we might see occurring.
So
I was going to say
volunteering, or what do you mean?
Yeah, I think volunteering, thinking about something that you could do in your community or in your organization. I know for me, I have a 4-year-old and a 14-year-old, so different ends of the spectrum there. But we have conversations with our older child around like what can you do so that you feel like you are having some kind of positive effect, right? Or impact, and how are you giving back to others, and like how are you demonstrating a lot of these qualities and I think values that we want our children to
Mhm.
grow up with. And so yeah, or even thinking about like bullying, right? Like what would you do, or like if you were in that situation, right? And kind of thinking a little more preemptively so that when it happens, you know, our children will have some of the tools or feel like they're equipped.
Well, that's
I
a great
think
point.
it's
A
really,
lot of us felt so powerless, right? Especially over the past year, right? We didn't feel like we had any agency over our own lives. We felt like we were kind of in this up and down Twitter news cycle, not knowing what was going to happen next. And that's a good way to take back a little bit of power, right? Sorry, Harold, what were you going to
no,
say?
I was just going to say, you don't, it's overwhelming. You mean
Yeah.
people are being shot, we can't go outside, and you don't want your kid to feel so demoralized that it's hopeless. I think it's just a perfect opening for Tony to talk about the whole idea of power of agency and how you need to give kids that skill set, because otherwise, you don't want to leave the house.
Tony,
Great. No, thank you.
that's your
Um,
cue.
I mean, I'd love to. I mean, I was
I'm
noticing.
his agent.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I was noticing for many years, even prior to the pandemic, prior to the election and the disruptions and the social changes taking place, anxiety was climbing a lot in the United States. It certainly was happening a lot in my office. And it was happening with colleagues all over the country. And lo and behold, we're an incredibly anxious nation when you compare us to a lot of other people. We are overthinkers. We focus on the future too much. And then, the question came like, are we losing our power and our control every day because we are warriors and we're hyperachieving and we're looking at what everybody else is doing and comparing ourselves to them? Could that be what's really making our lives hard, making it really horrible and causing some of the clinical rise in symptomatology that people have been seeing? And if you stop for a moment and you ask yourself, we do have ways to teach kids, and we can model it for them, how to think more logically, how to sort of check our own thinking, if you will, step outside ourselves, and I'm loving a lot of what the other panelists are talking about. Nina has touched upon it a lot. Is this idea of creating dialogues where you say, I don't know everything. I'm not perfect, and I can't promise you a perfect world. You wouldn't get on a plane to go to sunny Florida to have a wonderful trip, and your child looks at you and says, is the plane going to crash? You wouldn't say, well, I want to be 100% honest with you.
Yeah.
Statistically speaking, no, I mean, they're not going to understand that level of probability, but you can ask them what they think, and you can ask them how they know what they know. If they're getting a little older, mid sort of elementary school, their access to their critical thinking skills is there. Positioning yourself as a learner. It's one of these
Yeah.
agency tasks we ask people to think about is perfect for the parent. And you're stuck in this position constantly of having to be the expert and having to reassure and to protect. It's okay to step back, know you're not perfect, and begin to enlist their thinking skills to be able to help them feel better, soothe themselves, and solve some of their own problems.
So they're problem solvers alongside you. You're not sort of the oracle who's telling them what's going to happen. One thing that I think the news has, in a way, there's been some silver lining in which I think it has galvanized, especially over the summer, people to get more involved in civic affairs and to protest or rally or to speak up for causes that they feel passionate about. And families naturally want to involve their children. But that can be a slippery slope in terms of maturity level and age. And just to use an example, I took my 10-year-old to a Black Lives Matter rally, not a big one, nothing that I thought would be dangerous or erupt into violence. It was at the bottom of our street. And a family member saw, we took a photo, and a family member saw it and said, I can't believe you did that. That's so dangerous. Anybody could come and, shoot it up. It was, they didn't agree with my decision. Which I understood, but that did raise a question for me, in our hope to make our children empathetic and aware of the world around them, where do we draw the line? How do we decide what's appropriate and what's not? Is it based on age? How do we make those calls? And again, any one of you can chime in on that, but I think it's something on the minds of a lot of parents.
I think it's again a developmental issue and then also a personal issue. But I think you need to give your kids some context. We're not just going to the bottom of the street and hang out with people. You know, we really, I feel strongly that what's happening is not just. I believe that as an American, I'm going to do such and such, or as a citizen, and I think this is going to possibly make change, and that's why we're going to do it. Do you mean so? I think facts calm kids down. I think that when people get incredibly angry and have a tremendous amount of affect or become incredibly sad, kids pick up on that, and that loss of control of the adults in their lives makes them anxious. But if the parents are in control and are saying this is a conscious decision we're making, and here's why we're doing it as a family, I think that's really important. I think going back to what Nina said before, we do a lot of things in our house about gratitude when our kids were growing up. That literally every Friday evening, it was the end of the week, we'd go around the table and say, why are we lucky and why are we happy? Now, we couldn't tell the difference between happy and lucky, but it gave our kids an opportunity that if someone was really sick, if something really terrible happened, of course, we want you to tell us about it. But if you didn't get an A on a paper, or you didn't make the team, or someone was rude to you, that doesn't count as unhappy or sad. We want to try to look at something positive, which was just a gratitude experiment, and it becomes part of it. And I think the same thing happened with civil activity, whether it was cleaning up a beach or whether it was going to a soup kitchen in the morning of Thanksgiving, where there's something greater than yourself. I mean, church really works, the temple, synagogue, mosque. But if you're not a religious person, it really gives the kid an idea that they're not the center of the universe and that there are more important things. And we as families are units, hopefully for positive change. But again, it has to be explained in little bite-sized pieces, I think, that are developmentally appropriate.
I think that's a great point. I mean, we're talking a lot about breaking news here, right? Breaking news, things that are bad, things that are violent, some of the hardest things to explain, right? Especially letting a kid, I mean, again, me with younger kids, like just seeing the world reflected off of your young child when it's horrible is just a bad experience, right? It feels bad to let them know about all this stuff, right? But I would also say that, as a journalist, I believe that the news industry exists to create a place for people to learn about how the civic world works, what you can do about it to make decisions. I mean, it's not all bad, and it's certainly not all violent. I mean, you can talk about politics, right? Politics can be nasty. You can talk about policy, like how, there's a problem that the government is trying to solve. Some people want to solve it like this. Other people want to solve it like that. How do you think it should be solved? I mean, there's lots of ways. I mean, when I was growing up, we would sit and read the Globe, my dad and me and my mom. And, my dad would be reading the business section or some, and he'd want to tell me about like how trade policy would work and why you might want a stronger dollar or a weaker dollar. And, this is when I'm a little older, but like, it wasn't like, Andy, are you ready to like absorb this horrible information? Like, no, it's like, I'm interested in this. Do you want to talk about it? Like, this is what I'm like the Red Sox won last night. But like, I think you should not wait. Again, Tony said something about this too. I mean, the news is a big topic, right? Like, and you don't need to wait for something horrible to happen to engage with the news. And I honestly think the exercise of finding a way to interpret what's happening for a younger mind who's really just processing it is actually really clarifying and helpful and very fun. Like it to me, it reminds me why I got into this, because it's like, you need to, like, when I write a boring story and Dale's like, what did you do? And my other kid's too young to ask me that, but what did you write about? And I'm like, wow, that wasn't really that good of a story, right? Like, I can't find any way to tell you about this that you would care. Like, and so I really think it can be really fun and really rewarding, and the stakes can be a lot lower. That doesn't mean you don't need the tools that all these panelists are talking about, because it's really important to be able to navigate those things that everyone's talking about. And those tend to be bad.
But Andy, I think you have a
Mhm.
great point
Yeah.
when you mentioned the Red Sox. I think it's really up to parents to find what their kid's really interested in. It's kind of like you want the scaffold at the same level as the kid so that you're talking with them, not at them. So you were unusual that you wanted to know about trade. But the fact is that, if your kid really wants to know about the Red Sox, then I think that's newsworthy. Who are they trading? Who are they getting? Who are who's the best hitter? Who's the best catcher? What's happening at the stadium? Those kinds of things are newsworthy also. It's just something that your kid is interested in.
Right.
That's a great way to enter
Yeah.
it.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
And I love that you brought up that whole thing around all news, right?
Right.
And kind of what you're talking about and what you're describing about being in dialogue, that just helps with the relationship building too with your kids, because when they're younger, yes, they want to talk to you, but as they start to get older, they start to pull away a little bit. And it's just as important that they feel like, and you as a parent feel like you can still engage in those kind of more open conversations and you have that relationship to draw on. And I think also what you were talking about, Andy, and I think Tony, it falls into kind of what you were saying before around some of that sense of agency, right, around some of that problem solving, but also resilience building. It's like, thinking about enhancing your critical thinking skills, and engaging in some active problem solving.
Tony, this is more of sort of a abstract philosophical question, but I'm thinking back again to, growing up in the 80s, 90s, even earlier. Do you think that today's parent feels almost, I don't want to call it an unnecessary burden. That's not exactly the right word, but I think that previous generations of parents might have been a little more hands-off. Kids might have learned a lot more experientially or on the playground or at school or from TV. The sense I get as somebody who reports about parenting is this generation is very invested in molding and shaping the experience of their children, in terms of what they take in. Do you think that that is generated by just what's going on in the world and it's that much more intense? Or do you think that this generation of parents just has different expectations about what their role should be?
I mean, those expectations that you're talking about, and by the way, there's evidence that
Yeah.
kids are busier indoors more, not outside as much, not moving
Right.
as much,
Right.
achieving at much earlier ages. That goes all the way back, to the Hurry Child, David Elkind, back around 1979, 1980, sort of one of the earlier cries out there. And that's really pre-digital, if you will. We were all online and using social media. We construct our world, we construct our parenting, we construct how we relate to each other, and the amount of information coming at us is just extremely overwhelming, and it really does pump up adrenaline and cortisol, and and when that happens, we lose power, we lose our agency, we lose access to our critical thinking skills. You can't be logical, you can't pause, and you can't consider the value of information and make good decisions if your other part of the brain is firing on all cylinders, if you will, and warning you that something's wrong and you got to get out of there. So I think in order to become the kind of parent that doesn't follow the herd, and this feels like a herd that just keeps getting faster and more worried,
Yes.
and more overprotective and hovering,
Yes.
is to be able to use your intuition, which is something I think you did, Kara, when you said, you know what, I'd like to go down and I'd like to, let my kids see what's going on with Black Lives Matter. And sometimes we have a gut feeling, don't we? When we're calm and we can check in with that. And that to me is when you really have some of the best parenting. I'd like to just touch on quickly about something Andy mentioned, which was the idea of breaking news. I think, again, the way in which information is getting into homes and the way it's getting in front of kids may be more the culprit than the content. There's a study, after the Boston Marathon bombing, researchers reached out, 2013, was published in 2014. And they found people who were there at the event or around the event and wanted to see how much stress were they containing weeks later compared to people like most of us, myself, sitting in front of the screen just over and over, watching those video loops, those horrible images. People who were at home like me were showing higher rates of acute stress, post-traumatic stress disorder like symptoms than people who were actually down around Boylston Street that day. So it tells you something. It's a
Yeah.
lot about how and how much is being exposed to kids.
So what do you,
Kara, going back to your question about parenting, I
yeah,
think the United States had a big shift. There was no doubt that your grandparents or your great grandparents' attitude was that they housed their kid, they sheltered,
right,
shelter, clothing, educate, fed.
right,
There were no play dates. Kids went out and played. And Benjamin Spock changed a lot of that in the 1950s based on a lot of Freudian theory that, what was the kid's inner life like? And that really shifted. People started buying parenting books. I mean, Elkin, and then there was Penelope Leach. And I think that Tony's 100% right that what happened was that we became helicopter parents or hovering or concierge parents. And there became a problem that where do I end and where does my child begin?
yeah,
And
yeah,
so that's the herd, we've got to run faster. And then academically, high schools and schools got more competitive. There's just no doubt about it. We were catching up, whether it was the Japanese or the Chinese, the Russians. But the problem with that is that kids then are reinforced for their product, not for their effort. So that, a hard-earned C or B, where a kid is struggling with math, really should be celebrated, right? Versus an easy A. And that's not what happens. We change our mindset. And so the fact that failure is not an option. Failure is always an option, and kids learn from failure. And when we fail, we have a tendency not to tell our kids about it. I love the fact that Andy wrote a boring story so that, you can say, now when I think about it, that wasn't as interesting a story. I think next time I'm going to try to do it differently, which means that you want your kids to be able to take risk, right? To leave their comfort zone, go into a growth zone. And if it happens and it doesn't work out, it's all right. There's going to be another race. There's going to be another test. We'll be able to brainstorm and figure out how to do that. And I think that gives that moment where Tony's talking about reflection or thinking about what we just did instead of just another A or another home run.
right. And it's not incumbent upon a parent to react to every single thing, whether it's a C on a test or bad news that they see on Twitter that they have to process and discuss with their child. I want to talk a little bit about relatives and or friends and people with varying viewpoints on the news, which I think has become a hot topic, whether, it's masks or vaccines or the nature of COVID or politics. Families were really torn apart this past year, I think, by a lot of different divisive issues. What is your take on family members who might have very different spins on what's going on in the news than their own nuclear family? How do you keep those connections alive? Do you sever ties with people? How do you integrate those family relationships when they might be hard to manage? Tony?
I can jump in here because you're kind of talking about some people in my family.
Go for it.
We've always had
Conversation. Yes.
we've always, maybe I am that family member. I don't know. We have always had, the crazy aunts and uncles or the cousins or the grandparents. It's the broad band of human nature, right?
Yes.
It's become so politicized and so damaging now. It's intolerable. People are not speaking to each other. One thing that my parents left me as an idea among many that I think were worth keeping was, if you're going to feel obligated to please or to listen to everything that everyone tells you, you can certainly listen to it respectfully, but it doesn't mean you have to agree or follow it, and that it's okay to have your own judgment, your own ideas. This goes back to the idea of your own personal power. And so, in a lot of ways, this is really more about can we set appropriate limits and boundaries with even the people that we love and we're very close to or that we're related to? The answer is yes, and that may run the gamut from we just sort of curate the time, or we don't talk about certain things, we try to not get into that, to, there's limits that need to be set because it's so harmful to our values as a family that it just isn't going to be productive, and there's no way for this person to even to listen to us discuss it, to try to find a way to communicate. So I think for parents, it becomes this really great learning opportunity to teach kids, because they're going to have a whole life in front of them, right, where they have to deal with the influences of other people.
Mm-hmm.
I also would say that, we shouldn't approach this question with the assumption that we are coming to discussions about current events with the perfect set of skills to discuss them without becoming emotional or maybe taking cognitive shortcuts around really reasoning through our points of view. I think almost everyone who has to engage with the news right now is having trouble not getting sucked into this polarization. I think it happens to all of us. And it's really something that you have to work to avoid. And for me, I think if you're going to talk to your kids about the news, or you're going to talk to your kids about how their grandparents talked about the news, it might be a good idea to really, get off Instagram, get off Facebook, read up on it, figure out what is really happening, what you think. Why is why is someone that you really care about arriving at a completely different point of view on a similar set of facts? Do they have the same set of facts? Do we think they don't know something or misunderstood something? Like, maybe we can say that to our kids, but I think we should really make sure that we have taken the best track toward fully grasping the subject we're going to talk to about our kids. Polemic is not going to work on kids. You don't need to mold them into Democrats or Republicans. You need to help them understand.
Yeah, I like that, Andy. And it's almost like, taking our own pulse too, before we go and engage in a conversation, to kind of make sure that we're in a place where we can have the conversation too, without getting overly activated. And I think it's kind of related to what you were saying, Tony, that it's also an exercise in kind of being that example of tolerance for our children as well, that we can have, as adults, we can have different opinions, and it's kind of what we do about it, right? And kind of how we manage ourselves in those situations, so that our children can see that. And that, I think, is a wonderful way to teach about tolerance, but also to be able to talk about tolerance.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I want to go through, there's some really good questions that came from viewers. And there's one that sort of touches on what Tony was beginning to talk about that I'd like to pursue a little bit more. And that is, and speaking to Andy's point of, different sets of facts, how can I stay up to date, this viewer, I'm a journalist, this viewer, how can I stay up to date without building up stress? So you want to be able to have the right set of facts, or, an appropriate foundation. But to Tony's point, you don't want to be so overloaded that you're constantly stressed out and burnt out. So how can parents manage their own anxiety? I guess the question is. About taking information in a healthy way.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I personally have found that I've needed, and I've learned this actually for some other folks and parents, is I've had to cut down the sources of information coming at me. So I choose one or two, and I've actually begun to cut down the amount of time. I'm reading more than watching, listening more than watching. The watching news, if you will, really sparks up a lot of emotion, at least for me. And so I've been coaching some parents on that, and then trying to educate their kids, who are really more in a very multimedia, very, very fast bits and bytes kind of world, to at least understand that concept. What does it feel like after you've been on playing that game, relating with your friends, versus when you're off? What do you feel like when you're outdoors and you're probably not on a screen? What does that feel like compared? So they begin to have some appreciation for that. But until we, the adults, get ourselves calm, we can't model or teach how to do that for kids.
Mm-hmm.
I think time limits really make sense. You're talking about almost a diet, right? So the good part about an iPhone is you can see exactly how much time you've spent this day looking, at social media, and the problem is that it's very repetitious. You're in a bubble. People who go to CNN very rarely look at Fox. People go to MSNBC. And so I've suggested my diet is 10 minutes 3 times a day, because it's repetitive anyway. And frankly, since we have President Biden, it's not as there's not as many bursts. So that if I do it twice a day, I feel like I'm up to date. And I think Tony's right about the way that information comes. I think reading a newspaper, I actually am mostly one of the few people who still likes to touch the newspaper, but reading a newspaper is a reflective, you have to really absorb it. You finish the article when you turn to the next page, gives me enough, and I feel I'm up to date, even though if I looked at the Boston Globe online, there's an article that's going to appear in tomorrow's paper. But
Mhm.
there's just got to be a time of that's what I'm dedicating to this, and then I move on because there are other things that are happening. And it's a good model to show your kids that I'm concerned, but I'm not going to get obsessed by this. And I'm also not going to spend a lot of time doing this because it actually, after a while, isn't productive. It's
Right.
taking away from taking a walk outside or throwing a ball or going for a jog.
Okay, right. This is a hard question, probably not one that we can address in 15 minutes, but I'd like to hear people's opinion about it. One reader wrote in, how does a middle school, this person's a teacher, but I imagine this could be true for a parent as well, navigate a school's culturally relevant curriculum with a hypersensitive administrator who says, I don't even want the kids to know the difference between Democrats and Republicans. So maybe more broadly, how do you feel if your child's educational setting perhaps doesn't mirror your own personal family beliefs, or maybe isn't as culturally sensitive or aware as you would like?
I think this is becoming a national problem. I
Mhm.
mean, my wife actually teaches at the Dalton School, which has
Mhm.
decided to incorporate an anti-racist curriculum. You would think that why wouldn't everyone want to be anti-racist? And yet there's a whole bunch of pushback, not only at Dalton, but across schools across the country.
I imagine you saw the letter from the Brearley father.
Yes, I mean, it's just, you're shocked at how controversial this could be, but I think it speaks to, again, feeling comfortable with your school's culture. And if you really can feel comfortable with it, then in some ways that's going to be a big fight. That's much worse than grandma and grandpa because they're going to be getting fed something on a pretty daily basis that if it really disagrees with you, in the same way that there's a Miami private school that's anti-vax and has a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about vaccinations and about COVID. Could you feel comfortable with that? And especially when we're talking about private education, well, then we really have a lot of choices. If this was happening in a public school, I think it becomes a little bit more challenging. But
Yeah.
I think that kind of conflict is going to really present a problem for a kid because they have trouble with mom and dad feeling one way and they love their teachers and respect their teachers getting told something that's absolutely wrong.
Is there recourse for a parent? What
So
is a
I think you see that a lot of parents are getting hot and bothered. Before you get hot and bothered about it, I think it's a matter of going in and talking to the school and saying, I'm really uncomfortable with this. Can you explain to me what the purpose is? What's the lesson plan? How are we going to get through this? And before you write a public letter to the Post or the New York Times or the Boston Globe, can we, let's not throw the whole thing out. Once you do that, once you go public, I think it becomes very difficult to have a meaningful and reasonable negotiation.
This is another good question, and another one that it's a little more niche, but I think that it's very important. One reader says, what considerations are there for children who have disabilities, maybe sensory, maybe physical, maybe cognitive? Are there any specific strategies that can be addressed for them? Because obviously not all children process and have the ability to process things in the same way. Any tips for that? And I throw that open to anybody in the group.
I think I want to go back to something that I believe it was you, Harold, that said it, that was talking about it in the beginning around this idea of listening
Mhm.
to our children, and to really kind of get a sense of what they know, how they're understanding issues, what questions they might have, and then modifying your response based on what you know about your children and kind of how they learn best. I also want to add that I think we put a lot of emphasis on talking, where for some children that's not their modality, right? So maybe we think about things like drawing, or for some kids it's through sports. For other kids it's music or some other kinds of arts, or it's some kind of movement or dance or expression. But I think we have to broaden our thoughts around how we're communicating as well.
Right. And actually, to that point, I am thinking, and I think actually, Nina, I forget if we talked about this, but I know I've spoken to several people about this before, several experts of, you can kind of get inside your child's head a little bit and see what they're thinking by, what they're drawing or, what they're acting out in their play. And my next question was going to be, how can you tell if your child is actually beginning to struggle with perhaps, something like violence or being afraid of school shootings or being afraid of, you name it. How do you know that your child's questioning is going beyond a normal level and actually veering into something that could be more problematic?
I mean, you know your child, better than anyone, right? So you start with your own, again, your own intuition. And when you see things that change fast and the behaviors just seem a little bit out there and they're more consistent, it isn't just a sort of a one and done odd behavior or a bad night or something like that. It'll spark up some concerns in people. And I think that parents are really like the first line for that, but I don't want them also hovering and worried and micromanaging, because so much of development requires awkwardness and mistakes and strange moments. And there's I'm not sure if that answers it that way, but I do think you start with your own intuition. You keep your own anxiety in check. You watch, and then if you have a concern, then definitely reach out to a professional or a trusted person like a pediatrician.
I would also think that there are certain guidelines: sleep, appetite, passion for certain activities, social engagement. And so if your kid is a really chatterbox kind of mayor of the town, and then all of a sudden he doesn't want to go out, or a kid who really loves ice cream or loves pretzels, and then all of a sudden says no, parents are really good at that, to say something's off. Maybe he has the flu, maybe he has a virus, maybe something, or there's a crime. And I like 2 weeks. If something lasts more than 2 weeks, I think that's a red flag. I think that's where Tony's 100% right. That's when you pick up the phone and you check it out. And just think about it. You would never tolerate a rash for 2 weeks. You would
Right.
definitely do something about it. So a change in behavior of your kid deserves the same kind of respect that you give a rash.
I like that. A few resource-based questions. We have about 7 minutes left, and I want to leave people with some ideas. Are there any particular, resources, news programs that are kid-friendly, magazines? I happen to like the Week Junior for my fourth grader. He gets that every week, and it's really helpful. But are there any sort of sources of news that you would recommend for kids that are, not too sensationalist? This reader says, not too sensationalist or too scary. I feel news avoidant around my children and don't want to be.
I think NBC has the nightly news now for kids. And so it's online. Parents can view it ahead of time before you show it to your kids. And it's literally Lester Holt. It's the same anchor that we
Yeah.
get to watch as adults. And I know they're trying very hard. I think Time Magazine is trying also Time for Kids. I definitely think these are one of those topics where parents should review the material beforehand to see if you're comfortable with the content. Do you feel it's okay developmentally, and also as far as the perspective that you feel comfortable with it.
I mean,
But
the
they're
New
pretty
York Times,
professional looking operations.
I mean, the New York Times on occasion puts out something for kids, and one of the pullouts. I also get a paper, so and I enjoy it. And that's for an older kid. It's terrific. But I think they just say, well, we only do this sometimes. I would imagine it's not an easy thing to pull off, but it'd be great if there was, for kids who would want something, they could even just, download it and print it up and read it. And that way it's slower. You get to sort of think about the information, you could digest it, like literal reading of paper, or on screen, I guess, would be great. I have a recommendation, but it's more related to helping parents, get control of really the stimulation that's, in the house. It's sort of a local shout out to an organization I know called turninglifeon.org. turninglifeon.org. It's really about, in fact, their tagline here is keep tech in check. And it's not an anti-technology message at all, but there's a very nice, and it's easy to find, family media plan that you can download, that it just has questions, prompt questions, and just sort of a direction for sitting your family down and saying, what kind of family are we? How does information come in the house? How do we get overwhelmed? Everything from news to social media, so that kids are a part of the process of deciding how they're going to consume information and news and things like that.
Just in closing, with a few minutes left, as mental health professionals who work with children, and Andy, you can tell me as a professional parent and journalist,
I
what
don't
do you,
get paid for that, but
you should, we should. How do you think this generation of children will grow into adults? I mean, I think that I'm a kid of the 80s and 90s who grew up, like, I still remember when like watching Saturday morning cartoons was a big deal, and like Thursday night TV was a big deal. And like now that sounds so quaint, right? But this generation is, constantly overstimulated. They have so much information at their fingertips. Long term, for parents who are dealing with this, who are entrenched in it, 20, 30 years from now, what do you think will be the effect on their minds? What type of adults are we raising?
So I would tell you, let's not underestimate the effect of COVID. So COVID's going to have a very long psychological tail. I think there's going to be many kids who are not going to go running back to school with joy. They're going to go with trepidation. They've gotten comfortable hanging out with mom and dad if they were a little anxious, or the whole demands of social interaction. I think some kids will have PTSD symptoms. And here's the good news. There is going to be a group of kids going to be super resilient. Terrible events like the Great Depression, World War II, World War I, what we endured makes, the greatest generation. They do get some positives from this. But again, it's going to be based on how your parents scaffold you, how your parents protect you, give you encouragement and support, but at the same time, don't hover as much as we were talking, give you time to reflect. So I think that this is going to have an effect on this generation in a way that, not under 5. I don't think there's anybody who's saying, oh, I miss daycare. I can't believe I'm hanging out with my parents so much. I think most of those kids are just happy as can be that they're with their parents. But I think the 5 to 12-year-olds who have this learning lag and learning loss that's going to have to be recovered, and particularly the kids 13 to 24 who've taken the biggest psychological hits, I think it would be foolhardy to believe that it's just going to disappear. I think it's going to have a scar, or it's going to have an effect on them that we hopefully won't be too damaging or too scarring.
And I do think for some of the younger ones that, there'll be a social emotional toll that has certainly come as a result of COVID, and whether it be, different kinds of phobia or anxiety that we need to deal with. But I do agree with Harold that so much of it is going to be, kind of how they were scaffolded, and how the adults around them were able to provide them some support and kind of explain and help them process what they were experiencing. And I think it'll be a great opportunity for us to think about, as a country, the various systems and supports that we're putting in place for children and families as well as a result of all of this.
Tony?
Oh,
Your turn.
just, I couldn't agree more with what's just been said. I guess I would just add, like, how you behave may be incredibly important, not worry too much about the future. And go back to the idea of the scaffolding that Harold said is a really good point. How are you setting things up? How are you modeling yourself around your kids? How are you interacting in front of them 24/7, if you will? What are the opportunities, your level of optimism? You get all of those components together. You can think of it as sort of like nice positive guardrails that help protect them through a lot of the noise and the ups and the downs. And the truth is, we really don't know long term, right? Because who knows what the economy will be like, or what other unforeseen events would happen. But we have just the here and now to work with.
We just got just a comment from a viewer who says, as a parent and educator, I really appreciate how honest this conversation is. So they thank you. I thank you. This has been a really candid conversation. We touched on a lot of great topics. So thank you all. It's 1:00. So I will say goodbye and sign off. But thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you to our panelists for
Thank you. Bye.
thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.